Right. Today we have a meeting with a young and energetic person. He's representing a very great country in the world. They have a big role in Middle East in general and also in Iraq in particular. This person is Mr. Ambassador Stephen Hickey. Welcome and thank you for giving us your time to have this interview with you. And we wish you the best in your new job, and we wish you success as well.
Well, thank you very much for the warm welcome. It's great to be here in Erbil. It's my third visit here. I came 10 years ago, and it's fantastic to see the incredible progress that's been made here in the KRG in the last 10 years. So it's great to be back.
Okay, you're welcome. Mr. Ambassador, let me ask you a question. You had a meeting with President Masoud Barzani and also with the President of Kurdistan Regional, with Nishirvan Barzani, and also with the Prime Minister Masroor Barzani. So, what did you talk about? About what? What was your meeting about? Whether about Kurdistan and about in Iraq in general?
Well, you're right. I had 3 very productive meetings. We talked about a range of issues. Of course, we focused on the situation here in the KRI, and in particular about how the UK and the KRG can work closely together. You know, we have been friends and allies for many, many years. We have a fantastic level of cooperation in many spheres, whether it's on the political side, the economic side, or the security side. So we talked about how we could strengthen our cooperation in the years ahead. We also spoke about the current political situation here in Iraq. Okay. And clearly, I've arrived in Iraq at an interesting time. There are many challenges facing Iraq. We've seen the protests in Baghdad and other cities in southern Iraq. So we talked about that crisis, that political crisis in Baghdad, and how we could work together to find a peaceful political solution. And we also touched on the wider regional picture. Okay. Of course, Erbil sits in the middle of a very interesting and dynamic region with many challenges. And so we discussed the regional situation and how we could work together to ensure that Iraq and the KRI are stable, prosperous and democratic.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, as we say that we know that you have just started your new job in Iraq. So let me ask you, what's your impression? You said that your 3rd visit to Kurdistan. What's your impression about Kurdistan and Iraq in general?
So I have a very positive impression here in Erbil of the KRI. I think first you've achieved a huge amount, and just driving around Erbil, it's very impressive to see all the development that's happened on the economic side, and I'm very excited by the opportunities for trade and investment between the UK and the KRI in the months ahead. In Iraq, Iraq as a whole has been through a difficult time in recent decades. Of course, there was the aftermath of the 2003 liberation. There's been sectarian conflict, and then there's been the battle and the victory against Daesh from 2014. But Iraq has overcome many, many challenges and has achieved a great deal. Of course, right now I think we're at a very important moment in Iraq with the significant protests that we're seeing in Baghdad, in Basra and elsewhere. The UK we consider ourselves to be a very strong friend of Iraq. We want to help Iraq and Iraqis build strong institutions that can help make Iraq a safe, stable and prosperous place for all Iraqis. So right now I think we're working very closely with the KRG government and also with the government in Baghdad to try to overcome this current crisis and to find a solution that reaches a compromise between the demands of the protesters in Iraq and the government of Iraq. So that's very much our focus at the moment.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, KRG formed a new government and recently passed 100 days of it. So what do you think of the new government of KRG and its agenda?
So we have an excellent relationship with the KRG, and I met the Prime Minister today, and he talked about his very ambitious reform programme that he has set out. I think we strongly support his attempts to reform the government and to make the government more efficient and deliver better for citizens. So we want to support that in every way that we can, and we talked about that a little bit. At the same time, we also talked about the wider challenges in Iraq and how we can work together to tackle some of those.
Right. Mr. Ambassador, it's clear currently Baghdad going through crisis with protesters and violence in the meantime. What's UK position? This is very important. What's UK position about the protesters and the violence? Because UK had a big rules in Iraq before.
Well, thank you. It's true. We've had a historical relationship with Iraq, of course, and we continue to consider ourselves as the best friends of Iraq as Iraq tries to tackle all of these challenges. Now, with the protests, I've seen the protests and I've heard many of their demands, and I think everyone I've spoken to recognises that the demands of the protesters are reasonable and legitimate. Most of the protesters are calling for better job opportunities, and they're calling for progress in the fight against corruption, and they want better services, better health, better education, better roads and transport for ordinary Iraqis. So though I think there's a consensus that many of those demands are very legitimate and need to be responded to. At the same time, we have been very concerned by the violence that has been used against the protesters. There are reports from the Iraqi Human Rights Commission and other human rights organisations that close to 500 Iraqi protesters have been killed since the beginning of October, and close to 20,000 have been injured. Now, this is clearly unacceptable. We've made our concerns very clear to the government of Iraq, and we've had some constructive discussions with Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi about how to change things, and in particular how to ensure that there is no more use of live fire and excessive force against demonstrators, and also that there are transparent investigations into the killings of protesters and that people are held accountable. At the same time, the government, I think, have been correct in pointing out that there have also been attacks against government buildings and infrastructure. We saw the burning of the Iranian consulate as well, and this is clearly also unacceptable. There has to be the application of the rule of law, both towards the protesters and towards the security forces. And we very much hope that in the coming days and weeks that the security forces will act to protect the protesters from attacks, and also that small minority of the protesters that have been using violence will refrain from violence.
Okay, right. As we all know, all the Iraqi sides, all the Iraqi parties now, they are trying to have or to choose a new prime minister for Iraq. What does the United Kingdom wants and looking for a new prime minister to govern the Iraq?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that it's for Iraqis to choose their prime minister, Iraqis alone. It's not for Britain, and it's not for America, and it's not for Iran to choose Iraq's next prime minister. So a process is underway
Yes.
Among the main political blocs within the parliament to identify a new prime minister. I would say, that we hope that a new prime minister can continue the reform efforts of previous governments, and I also hope that it could be someone that can continue a dialogue between Iraqi politicians on the one hand and the protesters and the people of Iraq, because there has to be a dialogue in order to find a compromise and in order to find a peaceful political solution to the current crisis.
Brian, let me ask you about United States now seems to be that backing or supporting the protesters, but we don't see this backing or support from the United Kingdom. why the United Kingdom is quiet about the situation in Iraq?
I don't think we've been quiet at all. I think we've been very clear in our views about what needs to happen, particularly on the unacceptability of the use of lethal force. I also, though, I don't agree that the Americans have been backing the protesters, in a sense that I believe these protests, they're an Iraqi movement. If you look at the people on the streets, these are young Iraqis, many of them from Baghdad and the south of the country, they're the ones who are drawing the artwork, producing the slogans, coming up with the banners. I've been very struck that this is an Iraqi movement. It's an Iraqi protest movement. It's true that America and Britain have been condemning the violence. We've been calling for dialogue. We've been calling for reforms. But this is not a protest movement that's driven by the West. This is very much an organic Iraqi protest movement. And that's why I think many of their demands are being listened to, and why this protest movement is so powerful.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, even though the Iraqi government, they have these problems now, they have a big crisis, but even though the KRG and the Iraqi government, they had kind of agreement before, especially about oil and also about the budget. So, what do you think that the UK, they have a big role, this huge country, or the great country, what's its role to make these two governments closer about this agreement and to continue this agreement?
So we welcome very much the progress that's been made between the KRG and the central government in developing an agreement on the budget and on oil. We think this is very good, and we think that if a deal could be reached, this would be good both for the KRG and also for the central government in Baghdad. Now, obviously in Baghdad we are going to see a new Prime Minister and a new government in place, but when that government is in place, we as the UK and the wider international community, I'm sure, will be encouraging and supporting efforts to reach that agreement, because I think if we can get an agreement between the KRG and the central government, this will be good for the stability and the prosperity of the whole of Iraq. So we see it as our job as the UK to really support those efforts, led of course by the KRG and by the new Iraqi government.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, you supported KRG before and Peshmerga as well during the fighting ISIS. Let me ask you, are you going, this is a great really to be supported by United Kingdom, are you going to continue your support for the Peshmerga and KRG, especially nowadays? Now we see the ISIS, they are governing themselves and attacking as well the Iraqi armies. Are you going to support the Peshmerga as well, continue your support?
So I think you're right to say that the UK is supporting the KRG, and we will continue to do so. We also, of course, as the UK, play a big role in the global coalition to counter Daesh, and we'll continue to do so. I also agree with you that we mustn't lose sight of the fact that Daesh remains a threat, both in the KRI and in wider Iraq, and of course in eastern Syria. So as the UK, we are very focused on the threat from Daesh, both to Iraqis and to Syrians, but also of course to the UK. So we will continue to be very focused on this threat, and of course as part of that we will work very closely with the KRG and with the government of Iraq.
Okay, let me, Mr. Ambassador, this is as well, maybe it would happen if a sectarian fighting happened in Iraq. What would happen to Iraq? This is a big question. Are we going to lose the whole country? And everything is possible.
So, of course, Iraq has witnessed a great degree of sectarian infighting in recent years, and we want to avoid this happening again. That's why, I mean, there is a risk of further fighting, and we've seen significant violence in Baghdad, in Nasiriyah, and in some other places in Iraq. That's why we have to do everything now to prevent the violence from escalating. And I think the priority has to be to introduce political reforms and economic reforms to meet some of the demands from the protesters and to de-escalate the tensions that currently exist, particularly the tensions between the protesters and the political elites. So, doctors are fond of saying, prevention is better than cure. And I still think we're in that prevention phase, but it won't last forever. And we have to really focus on de-escalating those tensions. And the best way to do that is through political and economic reforms.
All right, let me ask you the last question, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Do you think planting democracy in a country like Iraq would grow up, or no? Because now the protesters and some politicians, they want to change the whole system, going back to presidential system. Doesn't mean that going back to dictatorship in Iraq. What would happen to this democracy?
So I think it's fair to say all over the world that building a strong and stable democracy is difficult, and it's hard work, and it takes time. And also, all of us around the world that have built democracies, we need support, we need help from our friends, and we as the UK want to keep helping Iraq build that democracy. We are not naive about how long this will take and about the challenges ahead, but I do think Iraq has really made significant progress since 2003, and we mustn't lose sight of that. Personally, I think it would be very dangerous for Iraq to abandon the progress that it's made on the road towards becoming a stable democracy. And I think you will often hear siren voices arguing that instead of a democratic path, it's better to pursue an autocratic path. But I think Iraq has experienced dictatorship and autocracy under Saddam Hussein, and I think Iraqis have learnt from that experience. So I think we have to continue to help Iraq build this strong democracy. And democracy, of course, it's about much more than just having elections. It's also about having the rule of law and having really strong institutions and having that connection between the demands of people and protesters and the political class. So that we need to work on all of those things. And I think if Iraqis can work together, Iraq as a whole, the KRG, Iraq's neighbours and the international community, including Britain, including America, including the UN, I still think there is a really good opportunity to strengthen Iraq's democracy and to build a stable and prosperous country here.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, thank you very, very much for this interview. Hopefully, I hope that we see you again, maybe in Baghdad or in Erbil.
It would be my pleasure.
And enjoy your time in the Erbil, the capital of Kurdistan.
Thanks very much. See you again.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.